the project that I've been involved in over the last, since 2008 now, is the site of Lymine in Kent. Just a bit of background to royal sites in Kent more generally. Most of them are known to us, or they enter the historical record as Christianised royal centres, as places with monasteries at them. And I've just mapped them, the main centres that we're talking about in a Kentish context. But what's long been recognised from place name, topographic evidence and cemetery evidence is that many of these monasteries have long ancestries extending back into the pre-Christian era, and indeed appear to have had an important central place function, political function, in earlier centuries. So we've got an interesting phenomenon of pre-existing political centres being monasticised, and I think Lymine demonstrates this very clearly, and we're looking at the various strands of evidence that contribute to this understanding, specifically through the case study. Lymine is located about 10 miles south of the regional capital of Canterbury. Actually, I'll use the pointer. It's not actually on the coast, but it has quite convenient access to the south coast. It's also located about 1.5 miles from one of the major Roman roads extending from Canterbury to the south coast at Lym, or the Roman shore port of Portus Limanis. And it's nestled in a valley that forms a natural communication artery extending from this part of Kent up towards Canterbury. It's the source of the river Nailbourne, which is a relatively small river that winds its way, that cuts its way through the chalk downs towards Canterbury. Now, we've long known about the Anglo-Saxon archaeology of Lymine, or its archaeology as a monastic site, through the work of Canon Jenkins in the mid-19th century. He was the rector of Lymine and conducted excavations within the churchyard, revealing a classic example of a so-called early Kentish group church, featuring close parallels to known examples in Canterbury and other sites such as Reculver. So it's one of these small chapels with an eastern apse and a likely porticus extending to the north of it. So it fits very well into that 7th century ecclesiastical tradition. There are problems with Jenkins' interpretations. I won't go into the details, but he claimed he found much more extensive foundations for much bigger basilican-style structure. That's very unlikely. We're probably looking at separate buildings belonging to different phases. But that doesn't change the fact that we've got one of these early churches. I won't go into the details of the historical tradition associated with a foundation of the monastery at Lymine. It's very complex. We don't know precisely when it happened. The tradition claims that it was founded in 633 by Queen Ethelburga, who's mentioned in Bede's Ecclesiastical History, but modern scholarship has cast some doubt on that. There is also other known archaeology before our programme of work that had revealed the pre-Christian antecedents at Lymine. There are 2 known Anglo-Saxon cemeteries of 5th and 6th century date, including quite high status 6th century graves, such as this example here. And there's also more recent work that's been done on the site that's produced evidence for horse sacrifice as one of the cult practices involved at this cemetery. The place name itself is also significant. Clearly we have a name here that points in the direction of Lymine's territorial significance by a relatively early date. It's one of these Gau name endings. So it's, in other words, the capital of a territory that has a topographical reference, the River Lymine, which is down on Romney Marsh, about 5 miles distant. So So we've been conducting excavations targeting open spaces around the churchyard since 2008, trying to connect those various fragments together and construct a narrative of how this place evolved as a place of power over the Anglo-Saxon period. And we've been able to recover some very rich sequences of early medieval archaeology that allows us to construct a narrative account of its development over this period. And we've got some very interesting and defined episodes of transformation, and I think that's particularly relevant to the theme of this workshop. So it allows us to explore the dynamics behind the formation of the Kentish kingdom and address a particular set of questions. How did the strategies and structures of power evolve during the prehistory of the Kentish kingdom before we get sort of good historical documentation in the 7th century? Another key question is what level of influence did the Romano-British inheritance play in the development of these places? There's been a lot of discussion about and speculation about these sites that I'm talking about having significant Romano-British precursors. Some of the, for example, Whitney, Everett, landscape historians have argued that we see long-term continuity in these sites. That was one of the questions we can address directly through the archaeology. What was the actual physical character of these royal villas like? Really yet to see that in the archaeological record. How do they compare to sites elsewhere? Do they display any recognisable Kentish characteristics? And what impact did the conversion and monastic foundation have on the trajectory of these places? So just to very, very quickly take you through the account as constructed from the archaeological record and our excavations. Well, we have good and clear evidence for 5th and 6th century domestic occupation under these areas of the village, taking characteristic form of sunken featured buildings and post-built structures. More recently, on a key site overlooking the River Nailbourne, that's the River Nailbourne there, we found what we think is likely to be the ancestral focus of this settlement. It's produced the earliest archaeology, 5th century in origin, focused on a previously undetected Bronze Age barrow, just here. And this is actually one of our 6th century halls laid out over the lip of the barrow ditch here. But more remarkable than the barrow, arguably, is this feature here, which is a very deep hollow. Now, in origins, we believe that this is a natural feature, a doline or a solution hollow that formed before the Bronze Age barrow was constructed. So it's likely to be the case that the barrow was constructed in direct reference to this earlier geological feature. I think there's good evidence for that. But we see a long sequence of appropriation in the early medieval period, starting in the 5th century. This feature is used in various ways. There are large burning events that take place within this hollow. There's lots of evidence for industrial activities. We have in situ hearths, but we also have masses of midden deposits that go in this hollow. But I think it would be wrong to see this as just purely, interpret this as purely a large, convenient hollow in which to dump rubbish. I think it's actually focal to the identity of this early community in the 5th and 6th centuries. There's lots of stuff being focused on it. The material cultural assemblages from this feature are very significant and very diverse. It allows us to date the sequence very closely because we have artefact types that are known from seriated grave assemblages from Kent. So it's quite a defined chronology, 6th century chronology. We have lots of evidence for feasting, very large animal bone deposits. with vessel glass. This single feature has produced over 500 fragments of Anglo-Saxon vessel glass, which is very, very unusual. This is a level of consumption that we only really see in a British context in sort of Celtic-speaking regions. Sites like Dinas Powys and Whithorn. This is really very unusual. But particularly apparent is different types of production. We've got smelting of iron on an intensive scale back in the 6th century. We need to do more work on this scientific analysis, but we do have tantalising evidence for the production of glass vessels at Lymine at this period as well. And also there's lots of different evidence for copper alloy working also. This site is then radically transformed in the 7th century, and we have the construction of a great hall complex of the type known from other sites like Yevering. So this is a Kentish version of one of these sites, displaying very similar architectural techniques. The plank walling that we're familiar with from these sites. The scale of the buildings is similar. The largest I think we've recovered is close to 25 metres in length and about 9 metres wide. But we do appear to have some distinct Kentish idioms alongside these timber buildings. We do have evidence for the use of opus sigminum flooring being used internally in these structures, of a type otherwise known from early churches. There's also evidence for this combination at a site in Dover that's less well known, and that's very interesting. That shows that there's a sort of a hybridity emerging in Kent, drawing upon influences and foreign influences associated with ecclesiastical architecture, with sort of the native royal aristocratic spaces and settings. And that's just a conjectural reconstruction of what Lymine may have looked like around the middle of the 7th century, and we use that extensively for publicity for the network, because it's quite pretty. Into the 8th century, there's another major transformation at Lymine. The site that I've described to you up to this point is seemingly abandoned and forgotten. There's complete spatial rearticulation of this settlement on a new site, occupying elevated position around and referencing the church that I mentioned was excavated by Canon Jenkins in the mid-19th century. And excavations up in these areas have recovered evidence for the 8th and 9th century settlement, or the Middle Saxon settlement, that displays many divergences from the archaeology that I've shown you previously. We have boundaries of various sorts that are articulating space in a much more structured way. We have another quite Middle Saxon characteristic showing up here, lots of rock-cut pits, over 100 of them found in association with this phase of the settlement. And we've also been able to identify and delineate different zones, functional zones within this phase. So we have a domestic zone located close, or sort of close up towards the core of the monastery, the church. Beyond it, we have a zone that appears to be associated. So that's the domestic sector. Beyond it, an area that appears to be associated with the management and conversion of agricultural surplus, including large threshing barns like this one here, of later 8th and 9th century date. As well as the sort of the architecture, the built environment, transformations that we can see in that dimension, Lymine has produced vast amount of faunal remains from all the midden deposits that we've sampled very heavily. And that's enabled us to see transformations in dietary practice. And Zoe Knapp's research is helping us to really get to grips with these aspects. She's working, her PhD is on the zooarchaeology of Lymine. And one of the clearest diachronic changes that we see is a shift to intensive exploitation of marine resources, and specifically deep water species of the cod family. Fish are exploited to a very limited degree in the earlier phase of the settlement, and there they're really going for inshore species, and also supplemented by eel. So i.e. the kinds of species that could be caught using fish traps. But a very different fishing technology is required to harvest these deep water species. So it's not only a shift in diet, but the implication is that there's also a quite significant shift in technology as well. And alongside that, we have clear evidence for diachronic change in animal species as well, and the main ones being a major decline in pig consumption, which is very high in the 6th and 7th century phases, and then as you move into the 8th and 9th centuries, sheep and chickens in particular really take off. Now, there's various ways that one can conceptualize this. Is this monastic dietary restrictions being followed within this community? Or are we just looking at more general influence of Christian diet on aristocratic consumption? I think it's difficult to say one way or the other, just because we don't have any clear evidence for what monastic rule was being followed in these double houses, as they used to be known. I think I've been told off for using the term double house, or nunneries perhaps is a better term. It's difficult to say on that basis. So just some concluding thoughts. So the work that we've done, I think, does offer a new platform for investigating changing strategies of power over the 5th to 9th centuries. Allows us to sort of push back our understanding to the shadowy prehistory of the Kentish kingdom. I've not mentioned it once because we haven't found any evidence for Romano-British occupation at this site, which I think challenges some of our previous assumptions about that type of continuity. If anything, what our work demonstrates is the importance of the prehistoric past in shaping the identity of Lymine as an Anglo-Saxon settlement. I think that comes across clearly. I think what also the archaeology emphasises is the 6th century as a dynamic period of change. We've got all the evidence production and centralised production as well, the controlling of resources back in this period. We might not necessarily see power emerging through monuments, but I think there's a potential of seeing it in other ways. I think what we can also say clearly from the sequence is that the construction of these great hall complexes forms a radically new yet short-lived strategy in royal power strategies in the 7th century. Kent, we can now say for definite, contributed to this process. It was engaged in this process very strongly, but it does nevertheless at the same time display some regional idioms. And what this sequence also allows us to see very clearly is the profound influence that monastic foundation had on Lymine's long-term trajectory. It triggered a complete spatial redefinition of the settlement around a new Christian core, and triggered important transformations in diet and other cultural practices. And I guess the other aspect to this is it conferred stability to a site that otherwise probably wouldn't have endured much beyond the 8th century. There are some important outstanding questions that we've not been able to answer so far, but I think are worth addressing. Was there a period of overlap between the hall complex and the monastery? We don't know that yet, but I think that's a very interesting question. Can we envisage a period in the life of this settlement when it was polyfocal, where you had the two existing side by side? And should we imagine that the roles of that earlier royal complex were directly overtaken by the monastery? Or were they inherited? Or were they renegotiated, and perhaps did those roles go somewhere else? I think that's a very pertinent question, and perhaps one that we can examine in discussions later on, and perhaps in the round table. So I want to leave things there and hand on next to Gordon.